As we entered the room, Mr. Gurdjieff, for it was he, raised his hand and, glancing calmly at us, greeted us with a nod. Then he asked me to sit down, indicating the ottoman beside him. His complexion betrayed his Oriental origin. His eyes particularly attracted my attention, not so much in themselves as by the way he looked at me when he greeted me, not as if he saw me the first time, but as though he had known me long and well. I sat down and glanced around the room. Its appearance was so unusual to a European that I wished to describe it in more detail. There was no area not covered, either by carpets or hangings of some sort. A single enormous rug covered the floor of this spacious room. Even its walls were hung with carpets which also draped the floors and windows. The ceiling was covered with ancient silk shawls of resplendent colors, astonishingly beautiful in their combination. These were drawn together in a strange pattern toward the center of the ceiling. The light was concealed behind a dull glass shade of particular form resembling a huge lotus flower, which produced a white, diffused glow. Another lamp, which gave a similar light, stood on the high stand to the left of the ottoman on which we sat. Against the left-hand wall was an upright piano covered with antique draperies, which so camouflaged its form that without its candlesticks I should not have guessed what it was. On the wall over the piano sat a large carpet, hung a collection of stringed instruments of unusual shapes, among which were also flutes. Two other collections also adorned the wall, one of ancient weapons with some slings, yataghans, daggers, and other things was behind and above our heads. On the opposite wall, suspended by fine white wire, a number of old carved pipes were arranged in a harmonious group. Underneath this latter collection on the floor against the wall lay a long row of big cushions covered with a single carpet. In the left-hand corner at the end of the row was a Dutch stove draped with an embroidered cloth. The corner on the right was decorated with a particularly fine color combination. In it hung an icon of St. George the Victor set with precious stones. Beneath it stood a cabinet in which were several small ivory stones of different sizes. I recognized Christ, Buddha, Moses, and Mohammed. The rest I could not see very well. Another low ottoman stood against the right-hand wall. On either side of it were two small carved ebony tables, and on one was a coffee pot with a heating lamp. Several cushions and hassocks were strewn about the room in careful disorder. All the furniture was adorned with tassels, gold embroidery, and gems. As a whole, the room produced a strangely cozy impression, which was enhanced by a delicate scent that mingled agreeably with an aroma of tobacco. Having examined the room, I turned my eyes to Mr. Gurdjieff. He looked at me, and I had the distinct impression that he took me in the palm of his hand and weighed me. I smiled involuntarily, and he looked away from me calmly, without haste. Glancing at A, he said something to him. He did not look at me again this way, and the impression was not repeated. A was seated on a big cushion beside the ottoman in the same posture as Mr. Gurdjieff, which seemed to have become habitual to him. Presently he rose, taking two large pads of paper and pencils from a small table. He gave one to Mr. Gurdjieff and kept the other. Indicating the coffee pot, he said to me, "When you want coffee, help yourself. I am going to have some now." Following his example, I poured out a cup and, returning to my place, put it beside the water pipe on the small table. I then turned to Mr. Gurdjieff, and trying to express myself as briefly and definitely as possible, I explained why I had come. After a short silence, Mr. Gurdjieff said, "Well, let's not lose any precious time," and asked me what I really wanted. To avoid repetition, I will note certain peculiarities of the conversation that followed. First of all, I must mention a rather strange circumstance, one I did not notice at the moment, perhaps because I had not time to think about it. Mr. Gurdjieff spoke Russian neither fluently nor correctly. Sometimes he searched for a considerable time for the words and expressions he needed, and turned constantly to A for help. he would say 2 or 3 words to him. A seemed to catch his thought in the air and develop and complete it and give it a form intelligible to me. He seemed well acquainted with the subject under discussion. When Mr. Gurdjieff spoke, A watched him with attention. With a word, Mr. Gurdjieff would show him some new meaning and would swiftly change the direction of A's thought. Of course, A's knowledge of me very much helped him to enable me to understand Mr. Gurdjieff. Many times with a single hint, A would evoke a whole category of thoughts. He served as a sort of transmitter between Mr. Gurdjieff and myself. At first, Mr. Gurdjieff had to appeal to A constantly, but as the subject broadened and developed, embracing new areas, Mr. Gurdjieff turned to A less and less often. His speech flowed more freely and naturally. The necessary words seemed to come of themselves, and I could have sworn that by the end of the conversation he was speaking the clearest, unaccented Russian, his words succeeding one another fluently and calmly. They were rich in color, smiles, vivid examples, broad and harmonious perspectives. In addition, both of them illustrated the conversation with various diagrams and series of numbers which taken together formed a graceful system of symbols, a sort of script in which one number could express a whole group of ideas. They quoted numerous examples from physics and mechanics, especially brought material from chemistry and mathematics. Mr. Gurdjieff sometimes turned to A with a short remark which referred to something A was familiar with and occasionally mentioned names. A indicated by a nod that he understood, and the conversation proceeded without interruption. I also realized while teaching me A was learning himself. Another peculiarity was that I had to ask very rarely. As soon as a question arose, and before it could be formulated, the development of the thought had already given the answer. It was as though Mr. Gurdjieff had known in advance and anticipated the questions which might arise. Once or twice I made a false move by asking about some matter that I had not troubled to get clear myself, but I will speak about this at the right place. I can best compare the direction of the current of the conversation to a spiral. Mr. Gurdjieff, having taken some main idea and after broadening it and given it depth, completed the cycle of his reasoning by a return to the starting point, which I saw, as it were, below me more broadly and in greater detail. A new cycle, and again there was a clearer and more precise idea of the breadth of the original thought. I do not know how I should have felt had I been forced to speak with Mr. Gurdjieff tete-a-tete. The presence of A, his calm and serious inquiring attitude toward the conversation must have impressed itself upon me without my knowing it. Taken as a whole, what was said brought me an inexpressible pleasure I had never before experienced. The outlines of that majestic edifice, which had been dark and incomprehensible to me, were now clearly delineated, and not only the outlines but some of the facades details. I should like to describe, even if it is only approximately, the essence of this conversation. Who knows but that it may not help someone in a position similar to my own. This is the purpose of my sketch. This was written this was written by an anonymous source, as some of you know. Okay, this is Gurdjieff speaking. You are acquainted with occult literature, Mr. Gurdjieff, began Mr. Gurdjieff, and so I will refer to the formula you know from the emerald tablets. As above, so below. It is easy to start to build the foundation of our discussion from this. At the same time, I must say that there is no need to use occultism as the base from which to approach the understanding of truth. Truth speaks for itself in whatever form it is manifested. You will understand this fully only in the course of time, but I wish to give you today at least a grain of understanding. So I repeat, I begin with the occult formula because I am speaking to you, in emphasis on you. I know you have tried to decipher this formula. I know that you understand it, but the understanding you have now is only a dim and distant reflection of the divine brilliance. It's not about the formula itself that I will speak to you. I am not going to analyze or decipher it. Our conversation will not be about the literal meaning. We shall take it only as a starting point for our discussion. And to give you an idea of our subject, I may say that I wish to speak about the overall unity of all that exists, about unity in multiplicity. I wish to show you 2 or 3 facets of a precious crystal and to draw your attention to the pale images faintly reflected in them. I know you understand about the unity of the laws governing the universe, but this understanding is speculative, or rather theoretical. It is not enough to understand with the mind. It is necessary to feel with your being the absolute truth and immutability of this fact. Only then will you be able consciously and with conviction to say, I know. Such was the sense of the words with which Mr. Gurdjieff began the conversation. He then proceeded to describe vividly the sphere in which the life of all mankind moves, with a thought which illustrated the hermetic formula he had quoted. By analogies, he passed from the little ordinary happenings in the life of an individual to the great cycles in the life of the whole of mankind. By means of such parallels, he underscored the cyclic action of the law of analogy with the diminutive sphere of terrestrial life. Then in the same way, he passed from mankind to what I would call the life of the earth, representing it as an enormous organism like that of man, and in terms of physics, mechanics, biology, and so on. I watched the illumination of his thought become increasingly into focus on one point. The inevitable conclusion of all that he said was the great law of triunity, the law of 3 principles of action, resistance, and equipoise, the active, passive, and neutral principles. Now, resting upon the solid foundation of the earth and armed with this law, he applied it with a bold flight of thought to the whole solar system. Now his thought no longer moved toward this law of triunity, but already out from it, emphasizing it more and more and manifesting it in the step nearest to man, that of earth and sun. Then with a brief phrase, he passed beyond the limits of the solar system. Astronomical data first flash forth, then appear to dwindle and disappear between the infinity of space. There remained only one great thought, issuing from the same great law. His words sounded slow and solemn, and at the same moment seemed to diminish and lose their significance. Behind them could be sensed the pulse of a tremendous thought. Gurdjieff speaking. Now, we have come to the brink of the abyss which can never be bridged by ordinary human reason. Do you feel how superfluous and useless words have become? Do you feel how powerless reason by itself is here? We have approached the principle behind all principles. Having said this, he became silent, his gaze thoughtful.